Hello and welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast, and today for something slightly different. You'll be expecting Bruce Hallas' voice, but worry not, he will be coming shortly. Today we are going to be putting Bruce Hallas in the spotlight, and he will be a guest on his own podcast, and that is what I'm here for. My name is Alexia and I'm part of the Marmalade Box team, and today I will be asking Bruce lots of questions on your behalf. And the reason that we're going to be doing an episode like this today is because we've had lots of emails coming into us at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast, and many of them have been centering around questions like, how come Bruce knows so much about this? How come he's able to ask such insightful questions? What is it that Bruce does exactly? So all of these questions and more are going to be things that I'm going to be putting to Bruce very shortly. So Bruce, welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, actually. This is really unusual. Yeah, I'm not used to being on this side of the microphone.
So, Bruce, I think a good place to start would be a little bit about the journey that you've taken to get to where you are today. So what is it that has led to you to doing the work that you're doing today? Where did it all start?
It was about 7 years ago that I kicked off the programme of research. It didn't even have a name. But the research really came off the back of that. I've been involved in governance, risk and compliance, information security for 20 years. And so for many of those years, people had asked me, okay, now that we've developed all these policies, process and procedures, how do we actually embed them into the organisation? How do we get people to actually comply with them? And, phrases that people talk about would be culture. And so I had a pretty... what most information security people would have viewed as a pretty normal approach to doing that. But there was a degree of frustration, I guess, about how effective those sort of standard approaches to the whole awareness, behaviour, culture thing, how effective they were. And so I kicked off a programme of research, partly really to focus for me to learn, to challenge me and all the years of experience I had in information security and embedding that within organizations to take the time out to challenge how I thought. And that's where I actually sat down and thought, it's time for me to rethink this. And that's where it sort of came from. It was like that the whole rethinking the human factor came from that. So yeah, and that was 7 years ago.
A long time ago. Now, I think it would be fair to say, though, that even in your career as a information security specialist, that you were already taking a slightly different approach to the work that you're doing. Is that fair to say?
I don't know. The best thing is going to have is a chat with some of the people that knew me back then, and they'd probably give you the honest answer. But for me, I think one of the things that really defined my way of looking at the challenge of information security was that I didn't come from a technical background. And back 20 years ago, I was pretty much surrounded by people who were very technical, totally amazing people. But I was quite different. So I actually trained in law and finance and marketing, and my early career was really around business development. Well, I was working for the National Health Service, actually, in their purchasing and supply. So it was, procurement practices, bids and tendering processes, asking the right questions as part of that due diligence. And so that meant I had a very commercial view on things. I had experience from a variety of different stakeholders, and the question I asked, which is now, interestingly, it's something that we see, and there's books like Simon Sinek. Okay, he's famous for asking why, and that's the thing for me. I was like, why? Why is information security even important? Why is it important to me? Why is it important to these people? And I think it's the process of asking why led me to this point where I was like, it's not about technology, it's not about security, it's about what it does to help an organization from cash flow, profitability and resilience perspective. Yeah, so my approach was very commercially focused for a long time and was more in line with the organizational stakeholders rather than IT. Yeah, so I guess that's what made it different.
So in terms of rethinking your whole approach, where did you start with that process? Where was this beginning point?
So this is a bit hush-hush because we shouldn't be talking about this. I actually looked at it and said, okay, we're rethinking the human factor. And the first thing I did is, I looked at what does it even mean to be human? And it's quite a philosophical start to the whole research program. But it's interesting because it really made me rethink, it just suddenly opened up a whole variety of things, which I think have led to the research, which has then led to the great guests that we've been able to get on the show. Being able to talk to people about this stuff, and then for them to go, aha, I didn't even realize that would be relevant to your particular industry. Yeah, sure, I'll come on the show. So yeah, I mean, what I did is I looked at the challenge. I looked at what it meant to be human. I looked at how humans interact. And I mapped out the whole process, the current process back then, of how we were trying to educate, make people aware of their roles and responsibilities in the hope. I use the word hope because back then we were make people aware so that they go and do what we asked them to do, what their roles and responsibilities are. And then there was a whole question about education of employees. And you go, all right, so now what we're going to do is we've made them aware. Now we're going to educate them. So we're going to transfer the right skills to them. And then we're going to assess their competency to be able to fill it. Okay. So I mapped the whole of that process. And then I did a risk assessment, which is what I do as a security specialist. This is what I did back in the early days when I started doing information security. It's all about risk. And so actually what I did is I did a risk assessment, and it's the thing that nowadays, our clients come to us and say, yeah, when we talk about risk, we're talking about this. And they say, what is it that you're talking about? And I just show them what we did in terms of mapping risk. And it's very, very different to what people are currently have been doing and what they've been doing for the last 7 years. So yeah, our risk assessment was the beginning of the process really for doing the research. And from that, we identified a whole range of disciplines, okay, which were just not on the radar when it came to the information security industry. In the early days, I still remember InfoSec Europe, the big conference that they have. I sat as part of a panel. I was really fortunate to be on such a distinguished panel. I felt a little bit like out of my place. I was like, wow, these are amazing CISOs here. And at the end of the panel discussion, we were asked, if you had one recommendation, what would it be? And there was a book called Nudge, which was part of one of the spin-out research areas that I identified around behaviours and choice and designing choice. And it had my notes in, and I waved it on the stage. This was 4 or 5 years ago. I was waving it on the stage, people saying, buy this book, Nudge Theory. And that was it. It was suddenly all these disciplines, choice architecture, behavioural science, behavioural economics, psychology, physiology, the physical elements of the human body, how that actually has an impact upon your ability to make decisions, the effectiveness of your brain at making decisions. Going into using my marketing background as well, the concept of if security was a product, would you buy it? And if you bought it, would you buy it again? It's just like we've convinced people to participate in the security debate and discussion, to come to our training. But if the experience isn't great, they leave with a sour taste about the brand, and they don't buy it again. And that's something that any marketing person, any brand person will tell you. They say the worst situation. It's hard work to get a new customer, to get them to stop buying their existing product and buy your product. Okay. But what's even harder is when you convince them to buy your product and then their expectations are nowhere near met. Okay. And then they leave. And actually the hardest bit is actually getting those people that you've lost back on board. And that is really similar to the challenges we face with security. So I think it was that thing of suddenly we identified all these disciplines. And then for me and my family, the hardest bit was then I was like, right, I've got to go off and, some of these areas I had a reasonable level of knowledge in, but it was about how do I improve on that? Because maybe it's knowledge from maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago. Some of the areas, physiology was something I didn't really know. Behavioral economics, I just didn't understand. I had no background. So, so what I did is I committed. In the early days, it was somewhere in the region of 30% of my time to just reading, researching, attending webinars, attending conferences, compiling notes, boiling them down into something that actually could provide gains to security professionals relatively quickly if implemented properly. Which didn't mean that they had to go out there and do the sort of commit 30% of their working time to doing research.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds like you've done all the work that means that security professionals don't need to do all that level of research because you've distilled it for them. Is that what you've done?
I did. One of the things that I was at a conference last year, and one of the things that somebody said to me is, what you've done is that you've done all the work up front, and then you've boiled it down into insights. But not only are they just insights about general awareness, behaviour and culture, so not necessarily unique to information security, but then you've taken it and you've seen it within the context of what we as security professionals, the challenges that we face. One of the most obvious ones is, people talk about marketing. A lot of people in education and awareness and, public speaking around these type of talk about marketing and, what we can learn from marketing. There's a lot we can learn from marketing, but there's one other lesson I can tell you about marketing. Marketing's got the money.
They absolutely have.
They've got the budget. They really, when they ask for the money,
they get it.
They get it. That's right. Okay. When security goes and asks for the money, even though they're talking about the same thing, okay, it's like, well, that's internal. I mean, even the difference between external facing comms and the budgets that are available and the resources that are available to do it, and the flexibility about delivery. Let's give this a go. It might not produce results. That's okay because you generate income. Okay. Whereas if it's internal comms, and this is something that a lot of people I talk to are actually from an internal comms background. So when we're doing projects, it's often working with internal comms. You talk to them about the budget, they go, "You got to be kidding me!" And they're like, going, "No, you have got a budget, haven't you?" And they're like, "Oh, we've got a budget, but it's nowhere near as big as security." There's another problem because the stakeholders that we need to engage with often do not have the budget, even that maybe security has got, especially post an incident, where, suddenly the money's available to security and they're like, okay, well, where's the money for internal comms to help them communicate the transformational change that we're looking at doing here? Yeah.
So the research that you did then, let me just get back to talking about the Rethinking the Human Factor work and all that research. So if you had to kind of distill the idea of what the research is about, what is it? What is the Rethinking the Human Factor? What is it exactly?
For me, I guess there are a couple of key things here. I'm trying to avoid the industry making the same mistake that it did about information security, what was called IT security many, many years ago. I'm trying, and there's I often use the quote from that's attributed to Einstein about the definition of insanity, repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So I can see, based upon my own experience over 20 years, that there is a possibility when it comes to the human factor that we're just going to make the same mistake we did with general security, which is the solution to the problem is a bit CBT here, certain processes here. It's all very control-based, point-based. It's the same as what we did with security years ago when we used to say, have you got security sus? And people say yes. And you go, what do you mean by that? And you say, well, I've got antivirus here, I've got firewalls here, I've got intrusion detection here, I've got content filtering, I've got email filtering, I've got all these different controls. And then there was this aha moment where everybody was like, it's not working, they're still getting through, people are still losing stuff, and you're going, yeah. And actually, the aha moment was, you can't guarantee 100% security. And the thing is, when I speak to people as part of the research, and even before the research, people would say, you can never guarantee that people are going to comply. And I'm like, absolutely. I say it's the reason why, even though we have rules throughout every culture, people will always break them. And there's lots of records to show that they are breaking them. So this is the thing to take away from it. You can't guarantee it. So we have to take a risk-based approach. Now, for me, the way, some people talk about taking a risk-based approach, but actually very different the way that we see the risk-based approach. So one thing we want to do is we want to stop us becoming insane in terms of repeating the same mistake that we did before. Okay, so that's one thing, part of the vision. The second thing was to turn the tide of influence, instead of the vendors influencing giving you the options as buyers. So you've got your CISOs, your education awareness managers, your security professionals, the people that are listening to the podcast, the Rethinking Human Factor podcast. Those people are being held responsible for driving behavioural and cultural change within their organisations. So they go to the market, and the market's saying, these are your options. What I want to do through the insights that from the research is to equip people with those insights to better define their needs. Okay, so they then take those needs to the market, because it's a market economy. If you tell the market what it is you really want, okay, from a position of understanding, of having taken the time out, which most people don't have. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do that for people because they are so busy, so they can ask questions. And they can turn around to vendors and say, well, okay, so these are actually our strategic objectives here. And operationally, this is what we need your product to do. How does your product do that?
So you're essentially empowering those that are really creating the strategy and the vision, empowering them with the insights so they are driving the market, and not, it's a customer-led market and not a service-led market or a vendor-led market. Is that what you're
taking
saying?
You from the back seat and putting you into the front seat might be another way of putting it. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's really, really important. And I guess the third point really in terms of what we're trying to do, and this comes back from, I kicked off a project called the Analogies Project, because, the biggest breakthroughs in humanity have tended to come from drawing analogy with other areas, other contexts. The Model T Ford is a massive breakthrough in terms of giving people access to cars, and then the potential benefits that came from cars. Nowadays, we look at that and we go, look what it's done. Okay, but back then, automobiles, travel was restricted to a relatively elite class who could afford it. Ford is attributed with coming up with the concept of the production line. But actually, one of my guests who was a storyteller and he wrote speeches for Bill Clinton. In his book about analogy, The Power of Analogy, he talks about this specific example, and he says, well, actually, the person who came up with the idea was a butcher. And he used to work in a factory where the cow would come in one end and would go through a process, and out of the other end would come all the cuts and the waste product as well. And he took that insight from that process and applied it to producing a car. And a breakthrough moment, the cost of the car came right down, which meant suddenly all these other people had access to it. And it's not just, cars. There are lots of examples where by looking outside of the immediate industry, okay, you actually get new insights which actually drive innovation. And that's what we wanted to do with the podcast, and the whole program of work was about bringing those external experiences from academics and practitioners around the challenges of awareness, behaviour and culture, and then sharing them with the audience.
So who is the Rethinking the Human Factor? That body of work that you've created, all that research, who do you think will benefit the most from engaging and adopting the ideas that are contained within it?
When I think about kicking off the whole piece of work, I was an information security professional, and I was probably near the senior end. The type of work I was doing was supporting CISOs, chief security officers, boards with their challenges around developing a strategy. And then the next challenge is, great, we've got a strategy. We've got, what skills do we have? What skills do we need to develop? How do we build the capacity? And then actually implementing operationally all the different programs of work, and then monitoring and maintaining it. So I kicked it off for my own personal benefit. I mean, back then I was like, I think I could improve on this. I could improve myself personally. And then when I realized how much of an improvement you could probably get, then it was like, actually, I need to share this with people, because really at the end of the day, if I keep it to myself, that's great for my immediate customers. But actually, we do need a bigger change. It's about an industry change. It's about making a big shift. And that means that, everybody that's listening to this has an opportunity to contribute to that shift.
You've talked about CISOs, you've talked about information security professionals. Who else? It sounds to me like this goes way beyond that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the one thing that I've been really happy to see over the last 7 years is the increase in the number of adverts for education and awareness managers, or education and awareness, officers, data protection officers, now have responsibilities around that quite clearly. They're quite clear that there are responsibilities. So education awareness managers, CISOs, information security professionals who are given the responsibility of this. And, by the way, a majority of the people that I speak to are information security professionals who've been given education and awareness as another hat. And it's like, how many strings to your bow do you have? But it's really not unusual. There have been a number of surveys which seem to demonstrate as well that actually majority of these programs of work are driven by information security professionals who don't really have any formal training in any of the disciplines that really make a difference here.
But I'm also thinking that you have HR, because obviously their role as HR is to train and to make sure that people have the right knowledge. Absolutely. But then internal comms, they have the responsibility to get the messages out to employees. So it feels like you're enabling cybersecurity and the security disciplines to kind of bleed out to other functions across the business, because actually it isn't a function-led idea in a business anymore. It's something that everybody needs to be living and breathing in order for the organisation to be truly effective. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's interesting you raised that, because we had a project. We were helping an organisation, professional services organisation, and they had offices around the world. And the process, we were specifically talking about information security, education and awareness as part of a standard that they were getting certified against. And actually the process of sitting down with the various stakeholders and explaining to them where we were coming from, and it was people like HR, it was people like internal comms, you are, just by being able to ask the right questions, suddenly you were seeing these aha moments. And we were tackling issues that actually were really fundamental to them for every other internal comms piece of work they had, or every other aspect of HR when they were applying with other departments. And I still remember the program manager turning around saying, this could apply to pretty much everything we do. And at that point I said, yes, but we're here just to look at information security. But it is true. And I think it's because when we did all that research, we didn't just focus on information security. I mean, to a certain degree, what we wanted to do is just like actually to exclude looking at information security people and bring those insights in. In that process, what we did is we were like, the challenges are the same for awareness, behaviour and culture in any particular business, in any particular domain. And actually, these are common lessons. And I think one of the most interesting things is that when you get your security function talking to those other stakeholders in an informed way, which could benefit them in terms of them doing their own job, not just the security internal comms campaign or the security elements within the context of HR, then there's actually a value exchange that's going on. They really want to work with you. They're like, these people aren't tech. These aren't a bunch of techies. These are people that are understanding the business issues, which are my issues anyway. And it just makes that relationship stronger. So, I think it applies to much broader than just information security, CISOs, education awareness managers and security professionals.
And actually a lot of this stuff applies on a personal level because of the way that we all are exposed to all of these security incidents on a personal level, having our bank accounts, the vulnerabilities we face as human beings. When you learn and engage with some of the ideas that are part of the Rethinking the Human Factor body of work, I can't help but thinking about personal incidents where I've been succumbed on a late Friday evening by a phishing attack and whatever, and all of those things that you talk about in your...
Did you? Our training's failed there, hasn't it?
But where you... So everybody who engages with these ideas can take away something personally. And I think that has got enormous value in an organisation where if they're learning something that they can actually use within their homes, with their families, with their personal lives, then it's just going to be, they're just going to pay more attention. It's more likely to get into them.
Do you mean to say that we're just humanising the whole thing? I mean, this is it. What works within an organisation, humans are humans in an organisation or outside of the organisation. The challenge is, but one of the most glorious moments within my research, and it didn't happen as a single moment, it's more been a collective wave as I've been researching, is just, I have this phrase, it's called design with the human in mind. And when you start to understand the process that people go through on a conscious level when they are making a choice, even the process of remembering something, and then making a choice, if you understand what goes on an unconscious level, how much of what you do day in, day out, at home, on the way to work, at work, going to the supermarket, taking the kids for a swim, going for a night out, when you understand the unconscious element of that, you then start to see, wow, that's how these attacks that I know about, they're all exploiting these particular things. And, I was having a conversation with somebody today, and I challenged them, I said, so if you know that, what does that help you understand or do better? And we were like humming and hawing about it for a little while. And then they turned around and said, well, then I know how to better design my efforts when it comes to influencing behaviour. And I was like, yeah. And this is the irony of it all. And I think the Wall Street Journal ran a really, really interesting article on this. It was about 2 years ago. And I picked up on it. I was like, this is amazing because, for WSJ, Wall Street Journal, to actually write something about this, it just says so much. And they were pointing out that actually cyber criminals understand how people operate, and they design their attacks with the human in mind. And for me, I was like, and what we've always been about at Rethinking the Human Factor is having the human in mind when we're designing how we're going to try to influence their behaviour and embed things within the culture. And it seems to me that, if you've got it's like you've got competition going on here. It's like, well, you can choose to avoid it and to deny it. Okay, but this is what they're doing. You're not on the same playing field.
Yeah, you need to get with the program. If the
get
criminals,
with the program, that's it.
The criminals are using it, then you need to be using what they're using to defend yourself against them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for listeners of this podcast and people that are really into the ideas that you're sharing around Rethinking the Human Factor, if people want to really take hold of these ideas and run with them and integrate them fully into the organisations that they're working in, how can they engage with the ideas that you're sharing as part of the Rethinking the Human Factor?
The simple ways that people can do that, I deliver training, so face-to-face, and we're about to launch our online range of courses as well. And in that training, we really take people on the journey. The Rethinking the Human Factor workshop, one-day workshop, is, it's a deep dive. It's a stepping back from your workplace and how busy you are. It's a platform for rethinking the actual challenge. And that process of rethinking, I can almost guarantee you, unless you've been listening to my podcast and read my books and all the other bits and pieces, okay, will open doors.
Yeah.
Okay. And, give you a sense by the end of that day, not only are the doors are open, but you've had a peek through each one of those doors, and you can suddenly see a whole new set of directions that you could be exploring. Okay. So, and then after that, there are a number of courses about Say Back. So Say Back is, we love an acronym in our industry. So Say Back, which is SABC, stands for Security, Awareness, Behaviour and Culture. And so one of the things that came out of the research was a framework for how a CISO or an education awareness manager might want to approach the challenge of the human factor. And I think what's been really good about that framework is that it has gone through ISO 27001 certification. So it's been embedded within an ISMS. So a lot of our listeners will have management systems of one type or other. So whether they're working with ISO 27001 or NIST or any of the management systems, this embeds, it just latches in. That's been a core part of what we're going to do. So we have these courses on Sayback. There are a number of different levels. So there's Sayback for those people who want to implement it internally within their own organization. And then there's a more advanced version of Sayback, which is for consultants who are independent consultants, who want to be able to help their clients with education and awareness. So there's a course there as well, and certification for that. So yeah, there's a range of training. And then there's also an option to actually engage with me directly and the team. And we can help with either a sort of running workshops internally, conducting a benchmark exercise, which has proven to be really popular with quite a few people. Where, we'll come in, we'll benchmark you against the framework, we'll produce a sort of a strategic review, and put a list of recommendations down about how your team can go about addressing the gaps with the benchmark. And then we'll come in and we'll help you through mentoring and coaching to maintain your momentum and deliver against those over a period of time. So the consulting piece, and then so really consulting, training, coaching and mentoring. There is something which I know you're not going to allow me to say, okay, but there is something which is coming down the pipeline, which has been driven by quite a few inquiries that we've had as well.
So I'm glad that you mentioned some of the ways that people can get hold of using and implementing these ideas, because a lot of the questions that we've had coming into the podcast and certainly through the inbox at Marmalade Box is, well, these are really interesting ideas, but how can I apply this directly to what, I've read the book. These are really brilliant ideas in Nudge and some of the other books that you've recommended. But how can I distill this and apply it specifically to information security and the challenges I'm facing in an organisation? And so what you're saying is if you created a framework that people can just use where you've done all that for them and they can just implement a framework where all of these insights and all of this learning is part of that framework. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the refreshing thing for me is somebody who's deputised on behalf of chief information security officers. I know what I would be expecting to see or what I want to hear. That's been taken into consideration when it comes to education and awareness. And when we have spoken with clients about this and they've looked at the framework, the one thing that they always tend to come back with and they go, so this would pretty much we just layer this over the top of what we're doing in terms of management process, the system, the governance we have, etc. And I think that's really the important thing. And this is a core part of the research. It's great to know, behavioural economics. It's great to understand physiology. It's great to understand all these individual disciplines. But it's all about the application of it within the context of information security. Now, and that's what we do.
When I hear you say research, I also am asking myself, and I'm sure maybe somebody listening to this might be asking themselves the same question, is are you suggesting with the framework that you've developed and the research that there is evidence behind some of the elements of this framework that suggest that if they go and implement things in the way that the framework recommends, that actually they can say with confidence that we're recommending this because there's evidence behind it? Is that what you're suggesting when you're using the word research?
Yeah, I mean, the research I did involved reviewing other research. So my vision is a data-driven approach to how we want to influence behaviour. I think one of the best illustrations of the integrity of the research that I've been able to then go and gather myself and read and digest is that, some of it's even won Nobel Peace Prizes. Okay. I think what's really interesting as well, as part of my own research, you start to understand how other companies, like big brands, are using this. And then, when I've spoken to people who've been on the training course, so they've suddenly gone away and gone, oh, that explains this. It's not been unusual. People that have been on our training course, they're going to go, I had this experience. What you taught us in the workshop, or on the course, suddenly made me think this. There was somebody that we did some work for who had attended an event in London with in a theatre with somebody who's Darren. What's his name? Darren.
Oh, Darren Brown.
Darren Brown. That's it. Yeah. And so he attended this event, performance, whatever you want to call it, and he suddenly realised that the trick that was being played, the performance, was actually based around an understanding of behaviours and in how to influence people. And on his way in, then when he left the event, he started to notice all these things that had been placed to increase the odds that the people, when they're who are asked to go down to the front of the stage and to choose a particular item, to increase the odds that they would choose this particular item. And that's really what we're doing in security. All the people that are listening to the podcast, it's like we just want to increase by margins sometimes, and I'm a huge believer in marginal gain theory. I mean, that's something I write about in the book, okay? But to increase the margins which mean that people will actually choose to comply with our organisational policies. We can't guarantee they will, but based upon the evidence we have, these techniques have been shown to work in other industry sectors, okay, and sometimes in security. That's one of the things that we bring as an organisation, is our experience of having applied this with other organisations. And we can say, okay, yeah, this is going to increase your click rate by X percent. And that's what really helps people. Yeah.
So are you saying you're the Darren Brown of information security?
No. Definitely not the Darren Brown of information security. Nowhere near as well paid, but less of a show, I would say, than Darren Brown. But I do think that it's interesting, whether it's Darren Brown using an understanding of what it means to be human, and then turning that into a show, okay, or whether you're a brand director for a major consumer brand and you've got a responsibility of, we need to increase market awareness by 20%. We need to increase our number of customers within that market by 15%. These are people that are given the challenge of communicating something and using that and other techniques. And by the way, it's not always communication that influences behavior. That's really important. But bring around behavioral change for a positive reason. In the world of security, it's about, we want to drive compliance and reduce risk.
So you said you don't put on as much of a show as Darren Brown, but
No.
as somebody that has seen, witnessed in the office you packing up for a workshop and the briefs that you sent out in terms of the venues that we need to find for your workshop, they are not like normal workshops, are they? You have a collection of accessories and things that you bring to the workshops that you do to help people really understand some of these ideas fully. And and they are more fun than I would say most security workshops are. Is that a fair comment? Certainly when I've seen some of their testimonials come past my desk,
Yeah.
words like mind blown,
Yeah.
I see quite a lot. So I just want to push that back, because I think in the context of the industry, if I could sign up to come to a workshop that had some of the things that disappear off in boxes over to the post section,
Yeah.
I'd want to go to that workshop. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
We do try to mix it up a little bit. So one of the things I most enjoyed doing was we created a flyer for the workshop, and we spent a bit of time embedding within the flyer references to 80s music,
80s
bands, and then putting in the small text at the end of the brochure.
Yeah.
We put in the small text. We made it clear. We said, okay, like there was basically it was a special offer we were offering for them.
Yeah. So if you can spot the 20 80s bands in this brochure, we'll send you a Now That's What I Call Music 1987 mixtape. I think that was the offer.
I think I've still got that, and the reason why I've still got that is that when we actually did the workshop, did anybody see the competition? And then was like going, what about the competition? And I'm like, yeah, the competition. And they were like, I was like, what competition is he talking about? And I got to the end, and nobody knew the bands. Okay, so I took them through the brochure very quickly, because we so much to condense in the workshop. Took them through it, and nobody had noticed it. And they go, oh, I didn't notice these things. I was like, okay. I mean, that's just one idea. We've used things like silkworms.
Actual silkworms.
Yeah. Well, these were they were dried.
So they weren't alive.
They weren't alive. So no silkworms were harmed. Let's make that very clear. No silkworms were harmed for the benefit of this particular exercise. But using the silkworm, the silk root, and the silkworm story, and we were talking about analogy and storytelling, and I was sharing some experience. I was using the silkworm, the silk root analogy that I've used for years. But that was the thing, it's about trying to introduce new ideas into it, things that people don't necessarily expect to happen. And yeah, I mean, that's been quite, for me, I like the challenge of coming up with new ideas around these things. I think for people that attend, it's like, there's going to be something that's probably going to be unexpected. There was almost a sense of tension. What is it that's going to go on? Okay.
What has he got in all those boxes?
What's in all those boxes? And then it's like, oh, how disappointing when we got through all those boxes. There is a dried silkworm. Yeah.
So, let's bring this back to the challenges of what's facing the industry today. Then, so what do you think the challenges are that the industry is facing when it comes to the human factor, specifically around the strategy aspect and devising a strategy?
I've been amazed how many people don't have a strategy
at all.
Yeah, I'm amazed, but not necessarily surprised. And it starts by even understanding, people talk about this, people have names for programs of work, the security culture program, the education and awareness, global education and awareness strategy. I did a piece of work with ISC Squared. We did a number of workshops around Europe, and I was asked to concentrate on security culture. The first thing I asked at the beginning of my bit was, okay, who here has a clear definition of culture? What they mean by culture? I think that we must have had 700, 800 people in total attend all these workshops. I only remember 6 people putting their hands up.
Wow, that's really low.
I mean, that's almost non-existent.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you talk, how many people have got responsibility for culture in some aspects. Actually, interesting. We did some research around on LinkedIn and all the jobs. So you can put in security culture as a job filter, and it will go through every job where culture is mentioned. Okay, it's amazing how many jobs get filtered through, get picked up by the filter, which have nothing to do. It's just mentioned as one other thing that you've got to be responsible for. Okay, people don't know what they mean by culture. I mean, how do you sign up? How do you have a security culture strategy without a clear definition of what you mean by culture? And when I say this, what I don't mean is these are cultural values. That's not what I mean by a definition of culture. What I mean by a definition of culture is, what does culture mean? Not what are your cultural values. The fact, values tells you that's part of the definition, but it's much broader than that. So if you go, from a strategy perspective, even when people talk about strategy, I'm like, okay, what do you mean by awareness? What do you mean by behaviour? What do you actually mean by culture? Okay, and most people have not got a clear definition, agreed with all the stakeholders within the organisation, what they actually mean by that. It's a bit like saying, I've got an information security strategy, but we haven't got a definition of what information security means. So
you can't possibly measure any level of success as to what you're doing.
Well, you not only can you not measure it, you haven't got clear objective. So the strategy is about saying, this is our objective and this is how we're going to get there. Without the objective, okay, you don't have a strategy.
So when we're saying, the main challenges that is being faced by the industry today, I mean, we're stumbling at
right at the beginning,
right at the beginning here, where if people haven't taken the time to define the very language that they're using and building programs around, I mean, where does that leave the subsequent strategy if there was one?
Well, it's a little bit, and this is the thing. I think we wrote a really interesting blog. I think for me, it was really a powerful blog. It was something that was very deeply personal to me. I'd had a conversation with somebody who had taken on a role as education and awareness manager some time ago. And what they came to realise is that, they were given the responsibility and their performance was measured against these aspects of awareness and behaviour and culture, but it never had been defined. More importantly, they had never asked the questions at interview. And I think it was really important. As I was saying to you, that was your point to identify where that organisation was in terms of maturity. And so as the CISO was talking about the strategy, that is the time to have been asking the questions, because it would have identified really whether the job was actually coming up with the strategy or whether there was a strategy already in place. It was clearly defined objectives in terms of awareness, behaviour and culture, and that your job as the education and awareness manager was to run a program of work that delivered against that. That's what you were going to be measured against. And this particular individual was really feeling it because the goalposts were being moved.
You just mentioned the maturity of the organisation. And I would imagine in such a field where so much of this knowledge is new, it's based on new research, people's jobs are expanding, functions are blending, there's different disciplines being brought in. It's a period of a lot of learning going on. There's a lot of new people coming in and moving departments and functions. Talk to me a little bit around the maturity aspect and how, obviously, there are going to be some organisations that maybe have been thinking along these lines in other departments, maybe elsewhere in the business for maybe a few years, and therefore their thinking is a little bit more mature, whereas others are they're just new to the party and they're just figuring all this stuff out. So just talk to me a little bit around the maturity aspect. But I would imagine that this will have quite an impact on the strategy that is developed, on their ability to implement something like that, and the speed at which they can start expecting results.
I think we have to be clear, for me, not to confuse with maturity models with strategy. Often I think people look at maturity models as a way of benchmarking themselves. So they'll sort of say, where are we on this maturity model? Okay, that's reasonable enough. That's benchmarking exercise. I mean, people do that with our SABAC benchmark. And then you get people that will go, where are we on there compared to everybody else in our industry? And that definitely happens. Okay. Whereas a strategy for me might very well be, it's not about the maturity level. It's about having your own strategy. A maturity level where you're, people are going to like from here to here, and this is what, other people say this is like a framework or a standard, and our maturity compared to that is this. That means your thinking in many aspects has been restricted to, we'll just use that as a standard to work against. And whilst there is definite value in that, and a lot of what happens in terms of security has done that. I mean, a lot of the listeners will know, might very well have experienced organisations who were driven by, we need to comply with ISO 27001. That is our strategy. We need to comply with NIST or PCI DSS, or we need to be GDPR compliant or whatever. Okay, they use regulation and standards, okay, as the means by which they measure their maturity. I'm compliant, but I'm not certified. I'm certified. I'm just nowhere near it. Okay, so you get these different levels of maturity in some aspects. Whereas for me, a strategy is almost, it comes from the heart. To come up with a strategy requires you to have invested time, ideally across a number of stakeholders, to come up with a vision. So John Cotter talks about vision. I mean, I'm a huge believer in vision, and most leadership is it's about establishing a vision, but that isn't necessarily a vision that you have on your own. And one of the things that I really enjoy doing is facilitating consensus about what the vision is across all the right stakeholders within the organisation when it comes to the human factor. And then once we've got that, so it's almost like it's the anchor. It's a psychological anchor. It might have been written down in paper as well. Then you tie the rope to the anchor is in many aspects the rest of the strategy. But because you have that vision, there's an emotional investment in it. You spent quite a lot of time. And one of the things I learned from a behavioural perspective is that where people have invested time and effort into something, they are much more likely to get right behind it, sometimes to the detriment of themselves, because people loss aversion is the phrase that would be used. But for me, that's the thing about strategy. It often comes out of that process of real thinking and rethinking and challenging yourself and the stakeholders. Whereas the maturity level might be against a particular standard. So, our maturity level around SABAC, there are in excess of 25 factors which we measure against. And some of them are the obvious things that you might think of in terms of education awareness, and some of them are really not obvious, but really came out of our research. I don't think they're necessarily the same. So you might be able to say, you might argue, well, our strategy is that we want to get to this point on the maturity level against this particular framework. I don't think the maturity level is the strategy. I think it might be part of how you achieve your strategy. Yeah.
So what you're saying is, and I really like when you say the vision comes from the heart, because I agree. I think having a vision that you can buy into, that you have ownership of because you've been developing that, creates a much more compelling vision. But then individually, as those stakeholders have to go around the organisation and get their own teams on board, are going to be able to do a much better job with that because they own it, they understand it, they feel it, they're part of it.
Yeah.
And that feels like a very important first step on that process.
It is. It is a really important first step. Everybody on the show will have already heard, it comes from the top, the mantra. I think we wrote an interesting blog on culture where actually I'd sat down and said, well, it doesn't always come from the top, culture. It comes from the sides and the bottom up as well. And I think we use an example of that about some of the things that hit the press in 2019 about how employees in organizations that we all think this organization, these couple of organizations, had really well-established, big, internationally renowned brands with internationally recognized values that draw in employees. It was a core part of their strategy, is about having these values to pull in the right people to come and work for those organizations. But then those people started to see a difference between what is said and what's done. Okay, and they all went out, and then they went on strike. And they were basically saying, hey, your cultural values that you say are this aren't translating into this as we see it. And so they pushed back against it. And sure enough, those things were taken into consideration. And for me, that was one of the important things about that blog, is to sort of, whilst acknowledging that culture is very much driven by leadership down, okay, it is actually the thing that really makes a difference, I think, in the day-to-day, because your executive board and your operating board aren't on reception, aren't on the sales floor, aren't necessarily in the marketing meeting, working through with a particular vendor, a particular problem. They're not there working with IT or manning the support desk. They're not doing any of those things, but that's where the majority of the employees are. That's why it's really important to recognise that it's actually from the bottom up, as well as from the sides in, as well as from the top down. That, for me, is what really will shift things from a cultural perspective.
So you've just talked about culture. And I think one thing that's quite interesting, from one of the things you've been mentioning, is you've talked about a security culture program, you've talked about people that are responsible for the culture of security. But I can't help thinking that actually there's an organisational culture which you just touched on, and you can't really think about these cultures in isolation. They're all part of the culture, in capitals. So how can you have somebody who's responsible for security culture and not really be having their eye on the bigger picture, which is the culture of the organisation as a whole? How do we marry that up? How does that work?
Well, okay, so the first thing I would say is that your question needs to be expanded. Okay. Because we were talking about organisational culture, and absolutely spot on to ask that question. But everybody that works in an organisation has spent probably a majority of their life living outside of that organisation. Part of the research that I've done and understanding how cultures are formed and influenced, a lot of our cultural values are embedded in us from the moment we're born through to our teenage years. Before we start the working career. That is when actually the really important values are embedded in us. Then organisations do their best as we join them to actually sort of reshape us into their cultural values. So they'll make statements about, these are values, okay, but then it's like, all right, it's a process of actually shaping people to comply with that. Some people will naturally do it, and a number of people won't. It'd be really interesting to understand is, how long people actually spend in an organisation. Okay, because if you've got a high turnover of staff, then this ability to actually reshape what comes through the door as employees, the new employees, towards your new set of values that you've got as an organisation, especially if those values aren't in line with the general national values that are going on, or the industry values, or whatever, or these other values, you're really up against it. So that's the first thing I would say. That I think the second thing around the question of culture is the security culture. I mean, even the language. Now, I will use that phrase because that everybody that's listening to the podcast will understand what that means. Security culture. But I remember having a chat with Gert-Jan Hofstede, and I put this to him. I said, "Culture, security culture," and he was like, "What?" And I was going, "Yeah." He'd go, "Why try building a separate culture?" And do you know what? I get it. The sense of when people say build a security culture, what they really mean is embed security into the organizational culture.
Yeah.
Because where you get cultures sort of coming together and rubbing together, you get a cultural clash. So, I mean, as you'll know, I've recently moved to France, okay? But I've been quite fortunate. I've lived around Europe because of what my dad did for a living. Now, he grew up in Yorkshire in the United Kingdom, which has, it's, you speak to anybody from Yorkshire, it's God's country. And don't argue with me about these things. And then my mother comes from the the southern Mediterranean. Very, very different. Cultural clash. Moved to France. I've and there are just things here, just culturally, between France and the UK, which is where I spent quite a bit of my life as well. Very, very different. And I think this is the thing around culture. Why would you want to try and build a separate culture to the organizational culture? Do we, by just using that language when we talk outside of the security function, is there a cultural rub? Is there what's wrong with the existing culture? And that's just about how you present something in a conversation. But, from my research, that's really important. Even the language, the words you use to communicate with people. And it could be that you're communicating with somebody that isn't, English, for example. So, but who understands English? They understand English from the words and the structuring of sentence, but they don't understand the cultural context. Just as, my understanding of the cultural context around when I speak to people in France it's just nowhere near mature. Okay, which is why I'm sort of. My view is everything's good. Everything's fine, okay? Maybe I'm just closing it off and sticking my head in the sand. But there is this bit that's I don't really understand. So I'm not going to I'm not going to get I won't be judgmental about that. But I do think sometimes, whilst it might be okay to use that language within the context of talking within the security function, as soon as you start talking about security culture outside the organization, what does that actually do on both the conscious and an unconscious level to your audience? And for me, barriers might go up straight away. It's like, oh, you want to change our culture? I mean, for many people, that's a bit of a no-no. It sounds like a lot of hard work for them as well. And from a behavioural perspective, if you want to influence people, the one thing you don't want to be doing is saying, this is going to be a lot of hard work for you. It's going to be really, really hard. Okay. What you want to do is it's going to be pretty easy. In fact, you don't even say that it's going to be easy. You just make it as simple as possible and they just go with it anyway because it is easy. That's just on an unconscious level. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in terms of, I just want to kind of try and wrap this up now, Bruce, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Is to try and bring all this together. When I think about, if somebody's sitting listening to what you've been sharing and saying, I love the idea of the research, I love the idea of using this new way of doing the nudge theory, the evidence that's coming through the research that's been done, and really applying this to the organisation and embedding security within the organisation. What is a good roadmap for them to follow? How do they just, if they want to do this well, they want to do it right, and they want to get the best results as quickly as possible, what is that fast track for them? What's the fast track for an organisation to start benefiting from these insights quickly in their organisation?
Fast track, my recommendations. One, either do a say-back internal workshop. Okay, we run workshops internally within organisations, get all your relevant stakeholders together. It's a one-day event. It is a real shakedown. Okay. 2, attend one of our public events. Now, we run those currently throughout UK and Europe. We're looking at branching out into the US and potentially as far afield as Australia. For anybody listening from Australia, I would so love to go and work there. There's some people doing some amazing stuff in Australia, actually, and New Zealand. I'll make that clear. And so, we have the public events. The one thing that we have found from people that attend the public events is that suddenly you've got a lot of people talking about a lot of different organizations. And so it's not just a shakedown, it's an absolutely shattering shakedown. Okay. It is absolutely exhausting. And sometimes people don't feel that they can be completely open because they say, well, I don't want to talk about this because it's really, really confidential. It's really, really sensitive organization. So if you think you're going to get into that category, then I go for the internal workshop. Then the other thing that you can do from a fast track perspective is get your own people trained to implement the say-back framework. Do do our risk assessment course. I mean, honestly, this is what I did at the beginning of the whole research. And from it, I was able to identify all these touch points, which then I was like, what are the marginal improvements I can do in all this? So if you've any experience of marginal gains, it's all about understanding all those different points and then finding the marginal opportunities for improvement in that. And the thing is, when I did that as part of the research, suddenly I was tracking things going, wow, the sum of all this is just going to be massive. So yeah, we do that. You can come and do the Sayback risk assessment course. Again, we can do that internally or externally. Or if you really want a shortcut, we do the benchmark exercise. Come and do get us involved. We'll come and do a benchmark exercise with you. And then we'll leave you with which acts often as a strategic review for many people at that point in their 3-year life, their strategy review life cycle. And then we can coach and mentor you and help skill you up so that you can deliver against those recommendations.
Yeah. Now, one thing that comes to my mind as somebody that's often seeking budget, does any of this help security teams to secure budget?
Yeah.
Because that's obviously a big challenge, is not getting the money they need.
Yeah.
So explain yourself, please.
In a lot of the organisations I work with who take a more mature approach to security and therefore are probably looking at the human factor because it's a little bit behind, most of their investment is being driven by an understanding of the risk to the organisation. So we already do strategic risk assessments and we do operational risk assessments. The thing that, because of my part qualified as an accountant, my thing has always been, well, what's the impact of this in terms of cash flow and profitability? So we help people understand the risk to cash flow and profitability, and it's when you have that, you have a much better case. And this comes back to the risk assessment that we do. It's interesting. I've worked alongside some pretty big consulting firms, and what we do is very different. This is the thing that I'm like, yes, we are ahead of the game on this one. We're hoping that people are going to catch up at some point. But yes, come and do the risk assessment workshop. Come and understand. Come and have us paint the picture, because it's when you've done that risk assessment, you can go back to business and say, this is the risk.
This is where we're exposed, and these are the gains we can have by going forward.
Yeah, but I mean, and it goes beyond that. It's not just about your exposure, about how you're currently doing things. But it also highlights how the gap between how you're currently doing things and how you'd probably be doing things now. I think it's really important to point out is often we get asked to work with people who will say, look, we're looking at developing a new education and awareness strategy to run over the next 3 years. Sometimes they find it quite challenging because part of what we're asking them to do, people sort of like think, okay, this is what I want to be doing now. And part of the review process is we want to do this. We need a business case for this, which is in the now. But a 3-year strategy is 3 years from now. And it's about having, and then I think this is what we bring. It's about having the vision about what will be more normal in 3 years from now. Because if in 3 years from now you do a review, you're just going to be then saying, well, actually, let's start thinking about what we can do over the next 3 years to achieve the things that we should have in now. So you will always be 3 years behind. Now, I think the reason why this is important is that one of the key things that has driven me about all my work is about being in a position that when it goes wrong, when there is a breach, that your organization is best positioned as a result of all your efforts as the CISO or the education awareness manager or the information security professional responsible for human behavior to demonstrate that you understood the risk and that you had taken appropriate controls, and that what you were doing actually would be arguable from a legal perspective as being reasonable and appropriate. And I think we had somebody on the show, we had a lawyer come on the show, and he actually alluded to the fact, as a result of the question I asked, about actually what you do when it comes to education and awareness, the thinking behind it, even the choice of the products that you go for, will have an impact in terms of how regulators will actually look at whether or not what you've done is reasonable and appropriate. And that's the thing about the strategy. The strategy is about sort of saying, 3 years from now, this is where you really need to be. That's your position, your target, your vision. You don't have a vision to be where you should be now. in 3 years' time. That's like, well, I'm basically saying I'm going to be behind. What has the business actually gained from doing that? Well, not a lot, I don't think.
So just going back to the regulator point. So what you're saying, what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that by having a well thought out strategy where you are seen to be thinking about it at a reasonable level of effort, and you're putting things in place, that if you can demonstrate that you have all of these things in place and it's been well thought through, that could you, and this is a bit that I just want to check in, is could you potentially be reducing your exposure if there was a fine or something that you discussions with the regulator? Is that what you could be looking at?
I think you're in an eminently better position to argue that you have understood the risk. You have through a process of proper risk assessment, not saying, well, these are the risky groups. That's not risk assessment. To a degree it is, but a proper risk assessment is somewhat different from that. And that's what we do. We help them understand that through our work.
So thinking about those that might be right now, today, going through a breach scenario, maybe they've just found out they've had a breach, or they're in the thick of it, and they haven't had all this stuff in place, and they're kicking themselves going, damn. Is there anything that organisations can do now in terms of trying to demonstrate to the regulators that they're really sorry, but we're really going to make an effort now? Can you take our future efforts seriously and therefore not fine us as much? Is there anything they could be doing now in order to demonstrate they want to be putting a good plan in place? Is it too late for them, or can they still
it's never
rescue
too late.
This?
It's never too late. I think the thing that's important is that, it's about putting your best foot forward. So, thinking about, what is your best position to be in? I think this is one of the interesting things from an education awareness. When I speak to people, I think one of the things that slows down some of our projects is the fact that when we're speaking to the initial stakeholders, that I turn around and I'll say, really need to have a chat with your legal team, and they're like, okay. And then there's I have to go and have a chat with the legal team to get them, to basically sell them having a chat with you, because they didn't think they had anything to do with this other than the fact that we had to deliver training. And but that's not the case, is it? What happens when it fails? Well, they're the ones that have got to be arguing on your case. And actually, this is where strategies really, for me, when I look at them, I'm like, strategies are designed sometimes really in isolation without really going back to the basics of all this. And all good security, I mean, the one thing that the industry is very clear upon now, though not everybody can unfortunately be in that position, is that, for years we were focused on prevention, and now we've embraced the fact it's going to happen. So now it's about resilience. It's about positioning yourself so you can argue that, actually, no, these things happen, but this is when it comes to talking to your clients and explaining why it's happened, talking to a regulator, talking to the media. It is about saying, look, we put our best foot forward, and this is the process we went through to do that. And it should be no different when it comes to the human factor as well.
Well, thank you, Bruce, for sharing a little bit about your story and how you came to do the Rethinking the Human Factor work that you're doing today, and also giving some insight as to what you do exactly, because I know that we get so many emails here at Marmalade Box saying, what does he do? I'd like to know a little bit more. I can't find it on the website. So this is really about helping you to better understand what Bruce brings to the industry, but also so that you can understand how he's able to ask some of the questions he's able to ask the amazing guests that we get on the podcast. So I'd like to thank you for your time today. You've been listening to Alexia and Bruce here at Marmalade Box. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to Bruce sharing his journey behind Rethinking the Human Factor. Now, if you'd like to learn more about Rethinking the Human Factor and how you can deliver a human factor-led strategy within your organisation, then you might be interested to find out more about the workshops that we do here at Marmalade Box. Now, these workshops are usually in person, and we run them in cities around Europe, but with the current situation that we're finding at the moment, we're moving all of these online. So if you'd like to take part in Rethinking the Human Factor training and helping you to develop a human factor-led strategy, then do send us an email here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast, and we will send you more details about this training that we'll be running over a period of 4 weeks. So it'll be 2 hours a week over 4 weeks, where you can start to develop a human factor-led strategy in your organisation. So here is the address you need to email us to find out more about that. I want to know more at re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com, and we will send you more information all about our training. Until next time, bye for now.